So you've got all these bailouts now coming to a head, you see. This whole idea of the Greek bailout. The thing I really love about it is the whole thing is couched in this language as if it's something that's designed to bail out the Greeks. Everyone talks about the Greek bailout. Well, it's not the Greek bailout. A whole lot of banks lent a whole lot of money to Greece when Greece was bankrupt, and now it looks like they're not going to get their money back. So now there has to be a Greek bailout so that they can get paid back. It's not a Greek bailout. It's all the banks who lent Greece bailout. We're getting to the point now where people, well, I probably people aren't, because, you know, people generally don't, but certainly some of us do, see that you've got a real crisis of capitalism happening here. And I say this because I would argue that fraudulently issued debt should not be repaid. And I think it's very important that it not be repaid for a whole number of reasons. Number one, it's fraud. To issue fraudulent debt is fraud.
Yeah.
So, straight out, you don't repay it. Why is it fraud? Why was the debt issued to Greece fraudulently issued? It was fraudulently issued because at the time that Greece was saddled with this debt, Greece was effectively already bankrupt. Now, if you're a banker and you make a loan to someone who's bankrupt and the bankrupt person can't pay your money back, who is on the hook for that? The bankrupt person or the banker? It's not very clear that it's just the bankrupt person's fault. The banker shouldn't have issued the loan in the first place because the receiver of the loan was bankrupt at the time and couldn't repay the loan.
But doesn't this go to explain all about what the banking system does?
Yeah, it does. It does. And this is the thing that I find really curious, is we come back to the whole argument about the creation of money and where money comes from.
So explain that.
And it's very important to understand that, you know, money is loaned into creation. So the point I'm trying to make here is the money that was loaned to Greece came out of nowhere. A bunch of bankers, whoever they may be, whether it's the central banks or private banks, or a bunch of bankers loaned a whole lot of money to Greece. And where did they get that money from to loan it to Greece? They conjured it out of thin air. One moment there's nothing, next moment there's 360 billion euros.
With interest.
And it's got to be paid back with interest. But the bankers who issued that money to Greece didn't have to work for that money, or slave for that money, or save that money, or build up any capital before they could lend that money. What they did was, they basically lobbied a whole bunch of politicians and turned the political and economic system into something where they, and only they, have the power to issue money out of nothing. And then to turn around and claim that whoever borrowed the money now has to pay them back with interest. So what you can do as a bank is you can actually go and you can target likely not to be able to repay kind of institutions or people. You can conjure loans out of thin air. You can give the loans to those people. You can then turn around and say, oh, you can't repay, now I want all your assets. Now I want your children to work for the rest of their lives to pay me back. It is fraudulent, it is criminal, it shouldn't be allowed, which is why actually in the beginning, because bankers were given this extraordinary privilege of being able to lend money out of nothing, there were controls on them. There were things like reserve ratios. There were things like loan to asset ratios. There were, you couldn't be a crook to be a banker and all these sorts of things back in the old days when banking was banking. That was the reason why these rules were in place, because you can imagine very easily a situation where it gets out of control.
Why are the banks so upset now? Because there's a referendum.
The banks are really upset now because if there's a referendum and if people start actually waking up to the fact that they have the power to say, no, we're not paying the loan back, that brings capitalism back into the equation. All of a sudden, everything that the bankers and the politicians profess to believe in. Market forces, capitalism, the free market, all these kind of things that they talk about endlessly. This shit might actually happen if the Greeks turn around and say we're not paying the money back.
So capitalism might actually come back.
Capitalism might come back. And what it means is you lend someone money at risk. If the risk goes up, the interest rate goes up. That's what capitalism does. And the reason why the interest rate goes up is because you might lose your money. And if you might lose your money, you demand more return on your loan to compensate you for the risk. But when you have a situation where all the central banks and all the bankers are all conspiring to keep interest rates at zero so that everyone can lend everyone money, no matter how poor their credit rating is, you don't have any price discovery, you don't have any capitalism. You have countries like Greece that are completely bankrupt, able to borrow money at 1% for 10 years. It is a completely absurd situation which cannot continue. If it continues, the entire financial system is going to blow up.
Is that not what the bankers are afraid of? Is that Italy and
yes,
and
of course,
the rest are going to follow?
No, well, it's not so much that they necessarily going to follow. They may well follow. The next lot who are now under the thumb of the bankers might turn around and say, well, we're not going to repay you either. And then the next lot and the next lot. But that's not a calamity. That's how it should be. That's what should have happened long ago. But the consequences of all of that is that everywhere, if people lending money now have to take into account the fact that there's a risk in lending money, God forbid, interest rates are going to rise. Now everyone goes, oh my God, that can't happen. Well, that's what capitalism is. You can't have a system with no feedback, with no price discovery. You can't know what anything costs anymore in our current system. You have no idea. You can look at a bond or a stock or a house or a property or a piece of artwork or whatever, and this thing is priced in dollars, but the dollars that it's priced in, like 20 million or 30 million or 40 million, if these things are all just conjured out of nothing and they're free to a certain section of the population, this money, these people can pay anything for these assets. They don't have to work for the money to pay for the assets. So they can pay anything. So the price of all the assets goes up. And instead of everyone who has to work for their money saying, no, those things are too expensive, sorry, can't buy it, no, what happens is interest rates get artificially lowered and lowered and lowered. So your average Joe can borrow more and more and more money in order to chase the prices of these things up. And then one day, capitalism returns, interest rates ratchet up from 0.1% to 1%, and all of a sudden everyone's insolvent. Yeah. And that is the world we are currently looking at. But we're talking about governments, and Greece is just the start of it. Because there is just too much debt. Yeah. And there's too much debt because there has to be too much debt when there's no price discovery, no capitalism, money conjured out of nothing. The only way the system can work is for exponentially increasing debt. And every single time there's any attempt to rein in the madness, things slow down a bit. That's called, that's a calamity, that's a recession, we've got to lower rates, we've got to print money, we've got to fix these things. We can never let capitalism do its work, ever. But we say we have capitalism. And you know, the scariest part of all this is when you link this all to the real world, you hear all the time that human beings are such wonderfully smart creatures and that our economic system, our capitalist system is so smart that what it's going to do is it's going to find solutions to all of our problems. Yeah? We've got climate change, we've got overconsumption, we've got overpopulation, we've got a runaway financial system, we've got all these problems. We've got poverty, yeah. we've got wars, we've got everything, and we get told that capitalism is the best way forward because it's the best way of finding solutions to all of the problems that are ahead of us. because of human nature, and capitalism's the best way to rein it in, and capitalism's the best way to let the market decide, which I actually happen to agree with. But the problem is, if it's going to work, you need capitalism.
Yeah, because we're not in a
You need capitalism.
Yeah.
Now, I'll give you a really small example. We have a situation where, let's say climate change is a real issue. Agree or don't agree, let's say it's an issue. And let's say there's certain things that are going to cause climate change to get worse, and certain things that are going to mitigate the problem. Now, in a proper capitalist world, the things that you do that are going to make the problem worse should start costing you more. And the things that you do to make problems go away should start costing you less. In other words, good ideas should be rewarded and bad ideas should be punished. That's the whole idea. But here we live, 2015, anything starts to happen to start to curtail the fossil fuel industry, to start to change the way people behave, to start making bad things more expensive. The oligarchs, the cronies, the governments, everyone steps in. They bail out the bad industries. They punish the good industries. They artificially set prices and rates. And then in the same breath, they talk about capitalism. We've now got a situation where our financial system cannot anymore solve any of the problems because it's stopped working.
Yeah.
Because there are no signals. There's no price discovery. Everything's rigged. Everything is rigged. Even now in Greece. Here we are on the cusp. You know, on the cusp. And you've got this tiny population with this massive debt.
Yeah.
And the only thing that no one will admit and realize is that that debt can't be repaid. There is all kinds of shenanigans going on to try and keep a completely insolvent situation going. Now, how's that capitalism? Back in the day, if you were bankrupt, you went bankrupt. And next time around, you thought about it before doing it the same way.
Yeah.
But now we've got Greece getting told, please, we know you're insolvent. We know you can't repay your debts. But please do us a favour. Take on a whole lot more debt. Please, just to save us. How ridiculous is that? And if we had gone through what we're going through now in 2009, 2008, and we had allowed capitalism to go through the system and clean stuff up, we would now be in a lot better position than we are now. And we're going to be saying the same thing in another 10 years and another 15 years. And then when the planet's melting, and then when no one can breathe anymore, because we just simply don't have a system anymore that can respond to anything other than short-termism, me, borrow, spend, never think about tomorrow, because that's always a problem, because tomorrow, shit, that means I've got to pay something back. No, forget that, I'll just borrow some more.
Out of thin air.
Out of thin air.